Alrighty, folks, now I got a question for you. What do you get when you cross a guy with a dream, a gun so bad it makes High Point look like a custom 1911? Well, you get one of the most spectacular failures in firearms history, and a cautionary tale that'll make you appreciate every reliable gun in your safe. We're talking about the USFA Zip 22 caliber. A pistol so cursed, so fundamentally broken, it didn't just fail as a product, it obliterated an entire company that had spent decades building a reputation for making some of the finest Colt reproductions money could buy. But before we dive into this train wreck, let me paint you a picture of what we lost. The United States Firearm Manufacturing Company wasn't some fly-by-night operation cranking out Saturday night specials. These folks were artisans, craftsmen that understood that when you're reproducing a piece of American history like the Colt Single Action Army, you do not cut corners. Founded in good old 1993, USFA set up shop under the Blue Dome. And yeah, that's the actual dome from the original Colt Armory complex in Hartford, Connecticut. Talk about embracing your heritage. They weren't just making guns, they were preserving a piece of Americana that goes back to the days when men were men and revolvers settled disputes. I mean, their reproductions were so authentic, so meticulously crafted, that even Colt themselves had to tip their hat. We're talking hand-fitted parts, case-hardened frames, and attention to detail that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep with joy. Collectors would drop $2,000 or more on a USFA single-action army, and they would do it with a smile because they knew they were getting something special. But every great tragedy needs a villain, and in this story, that villain is a man named Douglas Donnelly. Now, don't get me wrong, Donnelly, or Donnelly if you will, wasn't evil. He was just a guy with more ambition than sense, and a dangerous combination of creativity and stubbornness that would make a mule look flexible. See, Donnelly had been running USFA for years, and while the company was successful, it wasn't exactly printing money. Those beautiful reproductions took time to make, required skilled craftsmen, and appealed to a relatively small market of collectors and enthusiasts. Donnelly looked at this situation and thought, you know what, I bet I can do better. And that, my friends, is where our story takes a hard left turn into Crazy Town. Sometime around 2012, Donnelly got into his head that the world needed a revolutionary new pistol. Not another reproduction, not another traditional design, but something completely different. Something modular, affordable, and innovative. Something that would appeal to the masses instead of just collectors. So, enter the Zip 22 caliber. A name that should have been the first red flag because zip gun is literally slang for a homemade firearm of questionable quality and reliability. Now let me describe this thing to you because words alone cannot capture the full horror of what Donnelly unleashed upon the world. It's a rectangular brick of polymer that someone decided to call a pistol. About 7¼ inches long, which makes it longer than a Glock 43, but also thicker and more awkward than a teenager at prom. The whole thing weighs about 18.7 ounces loaded, which ain't terrible for its size, but here's where things get a little weird. There's no proper pistol grip. Instead, you got this flat back plate and a finger hole for your middle finger. Yeah, you heard me right. Your middle finger goes in a little loop, and you're supposed to wrap your hand around the back like you're trying to strangle a particularly uncooperative brick. But the ergonomics were just the beginning of this nightmare. Let's talk about how this thing actually works, or more accurately, how it doesn't. The Zip 22 is a straight blowback design, which is fine for a 22 LR. Plenty of good guns use that system, but here's where Donnelly's innovation comes in. Instead of using traditional bolts made of steel, like every other gun manufacturer since the invention of gunpowder, he decided to make the bolt out of polymer. Let me repeat that for the folks in the back. The bolt, the part that has to contain the explosion of a cartridge going off, is made out of plastic. Now you might be thinking, well, 22 LR ain't exactly a powerhouse cartridge. Maybe plastic can handle it. Well, you're wrong, and we'll get to that in a minute. The real problem is that plastic bolt is incredibly light. In a blowback system, the only thing keeping the bolt closed when the gun fires is inertia, and the bolt's weight and the spring pressure holding it in place, basically. You make the bolt too light and it starts moving before the bullet's left the barrel and pressure starts dropping to safe levels. This is exactly what happened with the Zip 22. The bolt would start opening while there was still pressure in the chamber, leading to ruptured cases, extraction failures, and all manner of malfunctions that would make a Taurus owner feel superior. But wait, there's more. Remember how I mentioned this thing was supposed to be innovative? Well, Donnelly decided that traditional charging handles were for chumps. Instead of putting the charging mechanism somewhere sensible, like on the side or the back of the gun, he put it right up front by the muzzle. That's right, to load the gun, you have to put your fingers directly in front of the barrel and push back on these little trapezoidal bars. Like someone looked at the 4 fundamental rules of gun safety and said, "You know what? Let's violate all these at once." There are 2 of these bars, one for loading and one for restriking in case you get a dud round. The idea was that you could reset the firing pin without ejecting the cartridge. In practice, the restrike bar was long enough to cycle a new round anyway, creating jams that would make a New York traffic cop jealous. But let's talk about reliability, because this is where the Zip 22 really shines. And by shines, I mean fails spectacularly. Most estimates put the malfunction rate somewhere between 40 and 60%. Yeah, let me put that in perspective for you. If you loaded a 10-round magazine, you could expect 4 to 6 malfunctions. That's not a gun. That's a very expensive paperweight that occasionally makes noise. The most common malfunction was failure to extract. Remember, this thing has no extractor claw to grab the spent case and pull it out. It relies entirely on gas pressure to blow the case backward out of the chamber. When that doesn't work, and it often doesn't, you're stuck trying to dig out a stuck case with whatever tool you can find. And even when the gun did manage to extract a case, it often failed to eject it properly. Cases would get stuck at weird angles, jamming up the action and requiring you to disassemble the gun to clear them. And speaking of disassembly, that's a whole other nightmare that involves more small parts and springs in a Swiss watch factory. Now here's where this story goes from bad product to company-destroying catastrophe. Donnelly wasn't content to just add the Zip 22 to USFA's existing lineup. That would have been much too sensible. Instead, he made a bet that would make a Vegas high roller nervous. He sold off all of USFA's existing tooling and equipment, the machinery that they used to make those beautiful single-action Army reproductions, to raise capital for the Zip 22 project. Let's think about that for a minute. The man took a company known for making some of the finest revolvers in the world and liquidated everything to bet it all on a plastic pistol that looked like it was designed by someone who had never seen a gun before. The plan, as far as anyone could tell, was to use the profits from the Zip 22 to buy back the old equipment and restart production of the reproductions. It was supposed to be a temporary hiatus that would fund a glorious return to form. Now let me tell you about the accessories and quote-unquote upgrades that the USFA had planned for this disaster, because apparently one bad idea wasn't enough. They needed a whole ecosystem of bad ideas. See, Donnelly didn't just envision the Zip 22 as a standalone pistol, no. He had grand plans for a modular system that would transform this plastic brick, well, into different kinds of plastic bricks. That's pretty much it. First up with the Zip SBR, and yes, that's what they actually called it. This was a shoulder stock system that would turn your unreliable 22 pistol into an unreliable 22 rifle. The stock even had a little compartment for medical supplies, which is ironic considering you'd probably need first aid after trying to use this thing. They also developed what they called a reverse Picatinny rail. This wasn't for mounting accessories on the gun, folks. This was for mounting the gun under something else, like hanging it off the bottom of your AR-15 as some kind of backup weapon. The manual actually suggested using it during magazine changes as if you're going to transition to your plastic 22 when your rifle runs dry in a firefight. Oh, in this manual, and I kid you not, described this as opening up Zip operators to the world of special operations. They're special, all right. They were marketing this thing to wannabe operators who apparently thought that having a malfunctioning 22 dangling from their rifle was somehow going to be tactical. They also made different sight plates, including one made entirely out of glow-in-the-dark plastic, because, you know, nothing says professional firearm like a gun that glows in the dark like a child's toy. There was even a Picatinny rail version for mountain optics, though why you'd want to put a $200 red dot on a $200 gun that can't hit anything anyways beyond me. And the disassembly process I mentioned before was another nightmare entirely. Most guns can be field stripped in under a minute with minimal tools. The Zip 22 required you to remove screws, springs, and tiny plastic parts that would go flying across the room if you weren't careful. There are tutorial videos for disassembling this thing that are longer than most people's attention spans. And get this, the bolt hold open feature was so poorly designed that if you didn't push the charging handle exactly the right distance, you would accidentally engage a safety feature that would lock up the trigger entirely. The only way to fix it was to cycle the action again, assuming you could remember which of the 2 charging handles to use and how far to push it. I mean, the whole thing was a masterclass in over-engineering a simple concept while simultaneously under-engineering every critical component. Like they took everything that works about firearms design and decided to do the exact opposite. So when the Zip 22 hit the market in 2013 with an MSRP of around $200, the response was, well, let's just say it wasn't what Donnelly had hoped for. Gun reviewers took one look at this thing and collectively lost their minds. YouTube was flooded with videos of people trying to get through a single magazine without multiple malfunctions. The gun community, which can be pretty forgiving of quirky designs if they work, showed no mercy for something this fundamentally broken. Sales were abysmal. Instead of tens of thousands of units Donnelly needed to sell to make his business plans work, USFA managed to move maybe a few hundred Zip 22s. Sheesh. The gun was so bad that even at $200, people would not buy it. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. USFA had no other products to sell, no revenue stream to keep the lights on, and a warehouse full of pistols that nobody wanted. By 2015, it was clear that the Zip 22 was a complete failure. Production stopped just after over a year, but the damage was done. USFA had burned through all their capital, alienated their customer base, and destroyed their reputation. The company limped along for a couple more years, probably hoping for a miracle that never came, and in January 2017, USFA officially closed its doors forever. Think about the irony here. A company that had spent decades building a reputation for quality and craftsmanship was destroyed by a single product that embodied everything they had previously stood against. Like watching a master chef burn down his restaurant trying to perfect a gas station hot dog. Now today, USFA single-action army reproductions are some of the most sought-after firearms on the collector market. Prices have skyrocketed because everyone knows they'll never be made again. What used to cost $2,000 or so now sells for twice that or more on the used market. As for the Zip 22, well, it's achieved a different kind of fame. It's become the poster child for how not to design a firearm. It's a gun that people point to for when they want to explain why innovation for innovation's sake, well, that ain't always a good thing. Ironically, Zip 22s have become collectible in their own right, not because they're good guns, but because they're so spectacularly bad, they've achieved meme status. People buy them as conversation pieces, as examples of what happened when engineering goes wrong, or just for the novelty of owning one of the worst guns ever made. But what can we learn from this disaster? Well, first, never bet your entire company on a single product, especially one that hadn't been properly tested. Donnelly could have been making reproductions while developing the Zip 22 on the side. If it had succeeded, great. If it had failed, well, USFA would still be around today. Second, innovation without foundation. Folks, that's just chaos. The Zip 22 wasn't innovative because it was better. It was different for the sake of being different. Let me tell you something. Real innovation solves problems. It doesn't create them. And third, you gotta know your market. USFA's customers were collectors and enthusiasts who appreciated quality and craftsmanship. They weren't looking for a cheap modular pistol out of plastic. Donnelly tried to chase a market that didn't want what he was selling while abandoning the market that had made him successful. The USFA Zip 22 stands as a monument to hubris, a testament of what happens when ambition outstrips ability and ego overrides common sense. It's a gun that couldn't perform its most basic function reliably, designed by people who seem to have forgotten that firearms are tools, not art projects. Douglas Donnelly, or Donnelly, again, if you will, destroyed a company that had taken decades to build, all for a pistol that couldn't make it through a single magazine without jamming. He traded a legacy of craftsmanship for a plastic brick that became the laughingstock of the gun world. But maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Respect the fundamentals. The basics of firearm design exist for good reason. When you ignore them in pursuit of innovation, you don't get revolution, you get the Zip 22. But there you have it, folks, a story of how one gun destroyed an entire company. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of betting everything on a bad idea, and a reminder that sometimes the old ways are the old ways because they work. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of firearm history's greatest disasters, well, do me a favor. Hit that like button harder than a Zip 22 bolt slamming into the back of the frame. Subscribe for more stories about guns that shaped our world for better or worse. And drop a comment below telling us about the worst gun that you have ever had the misfortune to shoot. Until next time, keep your powder dry, your groups tight, and remember, just because you can make something different doesn't mean you should. Y'all come back now, you hear?